And that jarring cacophony tells you you're back with the Power of Three podcast. And today we're bringing you a special episode to pay tribute to Jon Pertwee, the Third Doctor, the man who died 30 years ago today as we speak. I'm Kenny Smith, and I'm not alone. I'm with a fellow who watched the Pertwee era from the word go.
I am very old and aged, and I am Tom Harris. Hello.
Hello, Tom. Lovely to have you back on the Power of Three. It has been a while, but always good to see you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be back.
Indeed it is. So, Tom, you were a viewer of the Pertwee era. In fact, you even got the late Troughton era because of your chronological enhancement.
Yes, I mean, my earliest Doctor Who memories are of black and white fights between different Dalek tribes, and then of Cybermen killing police officers in the London sewers, and of Crotons attacking the TARDIS. And those were my... and also from Seeds of Death. I didn't realise it was Seeds of Death at the time. But the very first time I remember being terribly frightened was watching a scene where Ice Water was pursuing a scientist who was hiding behind a computer panel. And I mean, that stayed with me for many, many years. And by the time 1970 came around and both my big brothers had kind of grown out of Doctor Who, and I was just at the right age to start watching it properly, I was 6 years old. And that's when, of course, it became colour. We had one of the few colour TVs in our housing estate. So right from the very beginning of the colour era, I was watching Jon Pertwee in colour, and Spearhead from Space remains just one of my favourite television and, in fact, childhood memories. I remember watching every single Pertwee episode as it aired, except the Mutants. I know I watched the Mutants, I must have watched the Mutants, but when I was doing a rewatch, I couldn't remember a single frame of it, but I'm sure there's a reason for that, but everything else I remember reasonably well.
Amazing. So how did you, as a tender 6-year-old or thereabouts, cope with the change from Troughton to Pertwee?
It wasn't difficult because I knew the Doctor had changed, but because I'd seen so few of his episodes, of Troughton's episodes, Troughton was a stranger to me. There was a fairground attraction in Beath. Every year the fair came to Beath, and one of the rides for the younger kids had kind of cartoon illustrations on them, which I loved looking at because they were of Patrick Troughton and Daleks. And I remember going up there when I was a wee bit older and thinking, oh wow, that's the Doctor, years and years ago. But it was only a very vague memory for me. I think I remember the monsters from that era, but I don't think I actually remember Troughton. So really when Jon Pertwee falls out of the TARDIS, that's really the first time that I remember actually seeing the Doctor. So there was no big problem with transition. My oldest brother, Kenny, on the other hand, insists to this day that there was only one Doctor, and it was William Hartnell.
He is wrong, but he is entitled to his wrong opinion.
Well, quite. Interesting.
So, of course, these were the times when obviously Doctor Who became hugely popular again after perhaps a lull towards the end of Troughton's time, and were people playing at being Doctor Who in the playgrounds, making their own capes and stuff that you can recall?
I don't remember many capes. Capes were not a big thing in Ayrshire at the time. I seem to remember. I remember one night going out to play, being completely buzzed up by the cliffhanger on Frontier in Space with the Doctor being slowly suffocated in an airlock on the moon. And I remember going out and I was so excited to talk about this with my friends, my next door neighbour friends, and they couldn't care less. And I remember thinking, God, this is so lonely being a Doctor Who fan. No one else wants to talk about this. And I was desperate to talk about it because I was genuinely frightened for the Doctor. I thought he might die. Spent a whole week kind of worried about what might happen to him. Spoiler alert, he lived.
Yeah, because I mean, I think that's the thing, that when people engage with a doctor like that, they're buying the books and the merchandise and the ice lollies and things like that for Doctor Who Fights Master Plan Q and all that kind of stuff. Were you ever into collecting that kind of thing?
I remember the Dalek Death Rays,
Mm-hmm.
the ice lollies, because there was a competition when the Dalek Death Rays were first. I mean, the lolly themselves were delicious. They were mint ice cream with chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
But the competition that you could enter was to win an actual Dalek for your school. How disappointing would that be? If you won a Dalek and you couldn't even bring it home and had to keep it at school. I have no idea if anyone ever actually won it, but I remember entering it a few times.
So what sort of memories do you have of other stories that sort of leapt out, for example, Terror of the Autons, The Arrival of the Master, that sort of thing? Were there any particular highlights?
I remember Spear from Space extremely well. I obviously I've watched it many times since, but I remember very vivid parts of it that really scared me. The hunt by the Auton through the woods looking for, is it Canning? I can't remember.
Channing was the leader of them, and they were looking for the guy who worked in the shop.
The guy who worked at it, yeah. And he took refuge in a unit tent, and then the scene where the Auton slid down, tore down the unit and stepped through it. I was so petrified by that scene. I vividly remember I didn't hide behind the sofa. What I did was I made an excuse and left the living room to go through to my mum, who was standing in the kitchen, to ask if she would give me a gypsy cream biscuit.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure gypsy cream biscuits don't exist anymore. I can't imagine them being politically correct, but they were called gypsy creams. And I remember she had bought some, and I thought, right, if I use this opportunity to escape here, then it'll look plausible that I'm not scared stiff. And I was scared. I mean, it was a really horrifying scene, but I was addicted to it as well. So I remember that. I remember the Silurians. I remember vague bits of Inferno. I don't remember an awful lot, but I kind of remember it. But yeah, Terror of the Autons, I remember being very excited about it because, the previous season, Spear from Space had been my favourite adventure, and I was looking forward to seeing the shop window dummies, and I was a bit disappointed that they weren't really shop window dummies this time. They were big, smiley, kind of cartoon characters. But, that scene where Joe Grant is almost suffocated by the plastic coming out of the daffodil, that gave me nightmares for a long time. I mean, suffocation has always been a deep fear of mine, and maybe it stems from that particular scene. And then the scene where the Master tries to kill the Doctor by putting a little device near the phone, and the Doctor's on the other end of the phone, and the wires start attacking him. What a time to be alive when there was children's television like that available. I mean, my God, that stuff was genius.
Yeah, it's brilliant and never bettered. It might have been copied, but never bettered, which is fantastic. So a great production team there. What about the companions? Did you have any particular favourites?
Oh, it was always Joe Grant. Just loved Joe Grant. And as you know, and you'll have met her a few times, Katie Manning. I met her once with Nicholas Courtney at an event in London back in 2008 and got my photograph taken with her. I was just so chuffed because she really did mean a lot to me when I was a kid. And and also, that meant that when she left at the end of The Green Death was real genuinely sad. Not just seeing the Doctor, clearly sad, and we know that Pertwee was genuinely sad as an era coming to an end, but that had an effect on those of us who were viewing as well. And I think when Sarah Jane arrived the following season, it took a little while to kind of get over my resentment at Joe being replaced. Didn't take too long because Elizabeth Sladen was so fantastic. But yeah, Joe Grant was for me, that she was the definitive companion in that era.
What about the three Doctors? How did you find that, getting the old fellas back?
Well, for me, it was an education, and it was really exciting because I really only knew that there had been a couple of Doctors before Pertwee, but through talking to my brothers. So, the three Doctors became a bit of a family event for us, and because my brothers were curious about seeing Troughton and Hartnell reappear, and I remember vividly actually a bedtime game that we played on the night after the first episode aired. Me and my little sister, my big brother, and I played the Blob, chasing my sister, who was Joe, and my big brother, who was the Doctor. And my job was, as the Blob, to touch them and transport them to Omega's black hole stronghold. So, I certainly remember it capturing my imagination, and it was very thrilling to see the other Doctors.
Yeah. And what about Jon himself? Was that somebody you ever had the chance to meet?
Never did. No, never did. And I've got some regrets on that, because I probably could have if I tried. He did appear in Glasgow in the stage show, and I didn't go to conventions much in those days. Back in the 80s and 90s. So that's a matter of regret.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was lucky enough to meet him on a couple of occasions. The first time when I wanted to, I missed him. It was in '91 when he was doing the Pertwee Years video, but I had an exam that day. And he was in, I think it was HMV in Argyle Street, and I couldn't go in, so my sister went in and she got it signed for me. But she was a big Wurzel Gummidge fan, so she was all quite excited by that anyway. So she got to meet him then, and it took a little bit longer. It was when he was up, when they were saving the Glasgow police boxes. There was obviously a whole load of campaigning which I helped with and did the media side of things for the Glasgow Building Preservation Trust. And lastly, there was I think it was one of the phone companies wanted to do a photo shoot and use one of the boxes, but because they were owned by the trust, they had to get their permission. So got to nip along. I think I'd been at Disco Bride News and nipped out for a morning, and Jon was there at the box in Wilson Street when it was still in the middle of the street before they moved it to the side, and when it stood above the old public toilets, which are now long gone. So got to meet Jon there, and got a really nice pic of him on the phone. And in fact, I think there were a few media people there as well that got photos. And then the last time I saw him was just about a month before he passed away. He was at a convention at Scarrison in Glasgow, and he was going round and looking at various fanzines and just saying, "Hello, young man, how are you?" and things like that, and just nodding. So, yeah, he was an absolute showman, very much always on.
I did get to meet his son, Sean, at the official launch of the Royal Mail Doctor Who stamps in the 50th anniversary year. Mm-hmm. And that was nice, just to be able to say to him, look, your dad was my doctor. And I think he appreciated that, and we had a little chat about it, because, of course, at that time he had done a bit of work for the Labour Party, and I was still a Labour MP. Mm-hmm. So we had a little chat about that, but mainly it was just great to meet the son of a hero.
I actually had a wee interaction with him on Twitter a few years ago, and I'd got some lovely pictures of Jon and the family from Mirror Pics when I was working in the record group, and I posted these on Twitter and tagged Sean in them, and he said, "Oh my goodness, these are amazing, I've never seen these before." So I got in touch with his agent and sent him the high-res pictures, and got a message back just saying how delighted he was to see a lost little bit of his childhood. So it was nice to give something back to the family that
absolutely,
that he'd never seen before. So yeah, nice to have these happy memories. And talking of happy memories, why don't we pause now and hear from some of our listeners and our friends to hear what they've got to say in their memories of Jon Pertwee and the Third Doctor.
Hello, my name's Toby Haydock, and I like Doctor Who and things, but mostly Doctor Who. I was first introduced to Jon Pertwee through the medium of the Five Faces of Doctor Who, when I had the delight of watching Carnival of Monsters and the Three Doctors, and I was very impressed with his elegance. I think he struck me as very much somebody who carried off the look that he had, and seemed very much to me absolutely what a Doctor Who should be. And I was fortunate enough to meet him as well. He was actually too poorly the first time I tried, whisked away after a performance of the Doctor Who, The Ultimate Adventure stage play. He wasn't very well, and I think was soldiering on, but not enough to stick around with fans afterwards. But then he was touring later, and I think it was a one-man show about Tubby the Tuber. Does that ring a bell? At Telford, anyway. Telford, which was not far from where I lived in Shropshire, and a friend of mine and I hung around the stage door to meet him and had a brief chat, and brought up the rumoured forthcoming Doctor Who movie, and he did a kind of, "I'll believe that when it happens." They were always going on about that sort of thing. which I thought unnecessarily pessimistic of him. It turned out to be quite right. Of course he was Doctor Who, but he was very friendly, and we posed for photograph. But in those days, you had to get photographs developed, and that film belonging to my friend has never been developed, and I chased him up some years ago, and he professed no knowledge of it. So sadly, that is probably as lost as none of Jon Pertwee's episodes are. And I suppose if we were to have if all things were to be fair, that's the way round that we'd want it. So my loss is the BBC archive and Blu-ray range, and indeed all Doctor Who fans gain. I'm sure that's not really how it works, but nonetheless. But my main memory really is one of great crossness when Jon Pertwee died, because of the way that the BBC News reported it. Over a clip of Day of the Daleks, the BBC's entertainment's editor Nick Hyam said something along the lines of, "The acting may have been ropey and the sets might have wobbled, but to many children Jon Pertwee was Doctor Who." And I remember being furious about this and thinking, can't you even let a television icon die with a certain amount of respect? Do you have to do that BBC thing that was very prevalent at the time of kicking Doctor Who? Because this was during the wilderness years, and the BBC's continued attempts to sort of do down the things that it does well and piss off the audience that actually want to watch it. But that's a story for another day. I'm still cross, but I'm not as cross about it now as I used to be, because I've learnt through revisiting Jon Pertwee that actually the best thing and the most memorable thing about him is that smile, his always effortless attempt to give his innate panache and flair to the role, his absolute commitment to the show, his rapport with his other regulars, and his, dare I say it, his indefinable magic. He's a brilliant Dr. Pertwee, and his era is a consistently strong and terrific set of adventures. So I try not to let the reporting of his death dominate my love for his contribution to the show, and that means that I'm less angry now than I was back in 1996. You could say that I've reversed my polarity. That's what he would have wanted.
Hello, I'm David Steele of the Earth 2 podcast, occasionally on the Power of 3 podcast, occasionally on Opal City Confidential as part of Stop Let's Team Up, and occasionally elsewhere. Jon Pertwee, where do you start? Jon was the first Doctor Who that I saw in real life when we went to see The Ultimate Adventure at the King's Theatre in May 1989. I'm looking up at the poster, 37 years ago this week, more or less. My earliest memory of him was on Who Done It, which is an ITV sort of crime quiz programme. I have baked in memories of seeing that a few times, and of course, like a lot of people, like a lot of families, we watched Wurzel Gummidge and thought it was brilliant. And then when the Five Faces of Doctor Who came along, and my folks, we watched some stories with Doctor 3, and my folks pointed out that this was the same guy who played Wurzel Gummidge, I was stunned. Jon is also the first Doctor Who that I met, and this was in March 1992 when he came to the Paisley Museum and Art Galleries to open the version of the Behind the Sofa exhibition that was happening. And I got him to sign a book, and it was a thrill, because he was a little bit older obviously than he'd been when he played the Doctor, but he still had a real presence. And I remember feeling that when I saw him the second time I met him, which was at the appalling Scarrison Convention in Glasgow in March 1996. He was just such a big, strong, confident guy, but at the same time he was very warm, very approachable, and he was a legend. And it's weird, like, in the years since he died, I've become a much bigger fan of him. I think that I loved him dearly when he was still alive, obviously, and Third Doctor is one of my favourites, but I've become such a huge fan of him. I remember when he was on Wogan promoting The Ultimate Adventure in '89, and he did a great sort of turn and it was very good, told a few stories, and it turns out he told these same stories almost, it seems, on every other chat show appearance that he did. But I've become, over the years, a much greater fan of Jon Pertwee the man I read his book a good long time ago now, Moon Boots and Dinner Suits, and he was just such a fascinating individual. He had such a long, varied and interesting life. And it's a shame we lost him when we did. I think if he'd been around for a few more years, but he obviously would have worked for Big Finish and that sort of thing, and that would have been tremendous. And yeah, it's crazy to think that he's been gone for so long, because I remember when I heard about it, I was working at Abbey National, and a colleague came, what was his name? It was Bruce something. He said, just made me aware. And I remember sort of thinking, oh, right, I would rather have heard that from someone else rather than you. But no, I'm a huge fan of Jon, huge fan of his Doctor. I like I think he's very underrated. He doesn't get a lot of credit for what he does. There's a lot of humour in what he does, but there's real depth when you realise that, and I've banged this drum a few times. Third Doctor's, for the most part, is a political prisoner. And he's chomping at the bit, and he hates the fact that he's been exiled to Earth, and gradually he kind of thaws out and becomes, closer friends with the unit mob and gets settled and starts to enjoy it and things. And it's obvious that he really does love the unit people, because he never really leaves. Unit headquarters is his home base, and whatever adventures he might go off with Joe or Sarah Jane, he always comes back. And I think it's very fitting that sort of, he begins his era with an adventure with Nicholas Courtney as the Brig, and he goes out that way too. It's nicely bookended. The Third Doctor's era is the most consistent of the original series, I feel, in terms of tone and production quality and stuff, and it's one that I like and enjoy revisiting often. I remember seeing him on book covers when I was a kid, probably before I saw any of his episodes, and just thinking, right, okay, that's that Doctor Who. But when some of his stories were repeated in the early 80s and then started coming out in video, I was really impressed, and then when I did my big my consecutive watch through, he blew me away. I think Jon's portrayal has quite a lot in common with William Hartnell. There's a bit of humour, but there's also quite a level of quite a sense of taking things seriously, which you didn't always get with Troughton. The Second Doctor's very slippery, and what I think I like most about the Third Doctor is that he's so straightforward and secure, and you know where you are, and he's taking everything very seriously, and I think the Doctor works best when that's the case. But yes, Johnsy, I raise my glass to you, sir, and I salute you, and thank you.
Here's Keith Barnfather from Real Time Pictures, the producers of the Mythmakers range.
I first met Jon Pertwee in 1977, which I find almost impossible to believe. We were organising the very first Doctor Who convention, and I managed to contact him, I think, through his agent, and explained that we were going to do this convention, which of course was the first time anything like this had been done. And I got the message back, come and see me. So I went to see Jon in Irene, which was in the West End at the time, and he'd said, come and see me afterwards in my dressing room. And I went to the stage door, went to the dressing room. And at the time I was only 18, 19, and he was really pleased and surprised that I'd actually come to see the show before I came through to see him, which of course I wouldn't have missed for the world. And he was amazing. The thing that I always found with Jon, that he was so open to listen to what anybody ever said to him, and he would make his decisions based on that. I've always been people have heard me say many times, I've always been upset when people have said, he was in it for the money, it was always about the money for Jon. It wasn't. Jon would do things at almost any price or for free if he knew that was the situation for everybody involved. And I explained in his dressing room, about the convention and what we were trying to do, and it was the first one ever. And he just sat there and he said, I'll come. He didn't want a fee, he didn't want expenses, he didn't even want us to pay for his petrol, and that was it. We shook hands and I left, gave him all the details, kept in touch, and of course the history of that is legendary, of the very first convention with him coming in the morning, and I'll never forget it. And my life of knowing him until the day, literally until the time that he passed away, was a man who was honourable, straightforward, utterly professional. I mean, I was so young when I first met him, and even then he was nearly 60, I think. But we always got on, and I don't know why he he gave me so much time, but I've always been incredibly grateful to him for that. And of course, with this led doing 2 conventions with him, then just staying friends, doing his Myth Makers, and then doing Return to Devil's End, which of course was the greatest time that we all spent together, getting him and Nick Courtney and John Levine and Richard Franklin and Christopher Barry all together at Allborn. And I have such fond memories of all of that time. And I met him many, many, many times again, and he was always kind, always pleased to see me, and I was always obviously delighted to see him. And I miss him today. I think of him often, and I'll always be in his debt for what he trusted me with, and how I wish I could have done a drama with him. That perhaps is the one thing I would have loved to have done. But, these things happen, that's life. And oddly, being asked to do this podcast at the time when I'm actually right now, somebody suggested to me at a Doctor Who convention few years ago now, you must have shot lots and lots of rushes for Return to Devil's End. I'd love to see them. And I said, yeah, no, that's a really good idea. And it was, but I sort of went, and then after I sort of thought about it, I thought, my God, I'd like to see these rushes. And I dug them out and I went through them and I thought, right, I'm going to re-release, but I'm going to release it with the entire rushes, and that everybody realizes what they're going to get. This isn't a polished production. This is literally the rushes for Return to Devil's End. So there you go, guys. And a sort of big circle that's coming back to the beginning again. And thank you, John. What else could I say?
Hello, Power 3. It's your old pal Dave Turbot here. You might remember me from such DVD documentaries as the Galaxy 4 DVD extra Celestial Toy Room, or Daleks Beyond the Screen. So Jon Pertwee was someone who I first saw as Wurzel Gummidge. Definitely saw repeats of Wurzel Gummidge on TV during the early 80s, which I think I found creepy and not funny. So I probably just thought he was a bit of a weird actor doing this strange part. And then of course I would have cottoned on, or maybe my dad would have pointed out a couple of years later, that he was the voice of Spotty on Super Ted as well, which is obviously a slightly more sympathetic character. And you thought, oh, okay, well, there's maybe more to this guy than just that weird scarecrow thing. Now, I got into Doctor Who during the 25th anniversary, so one of the things the books that I would have picked up would have been the 25 Glorious Years book. And of course, there's loads of photos of his Doctor in that. And I think it's weird how much he stands out after the first 2 Doctors as this very colourful, flamboyant guy. And I think to a 10-year-old boy, that actually looks really cool and confident. He's there with this kind of frilled shirt, and he's quite out there. He's just got a very kind of bold look, frilled shirt, velvet jacket. It's sort of old at one point, but he's also flying around a time machine, which makes him look sort of futuristic as well. So I actually thought he looked pretty cool in that book. And I think it would have been after that, actually, that I would have actually seen him in motion in Spearhead from Space, probably on VHS at a pal's house, which is that weird feeling of seeing an actor move for the first time as a character, and you've only seen them in stills. And it's always kind of jarring a little bit when you see that happen at first, because you're like, oh, that's not how I thought that was going to be. And you're thinking, oh, he sounds a lot more English than I thought he would, and he's saying all these things like old chap and my dear, and is he quite old-fashioned, really? But then I think I probably watched the 5 Doctors after that, where he's kind of basically doing a greatest hits version of his own Doctor, with all the Raston warrior robot weapons, and he's driving Bessie, and that was cool to see for the first time as well. I think he's a lot of it's tied in with memories of seeing these things happening on VHS for the first time. Showing my age a bit there, but that's how I experienced a lot of his Doctor. So I realised looking into this that it wasn't long after that I would have seen the Ultimate Adventure stage show. I think probably first of all seeing the promo interview that he did on Wogan. taken photos of that on telly. Obviously, they turned out terribly. It's not like, definitely not telly snaps. But so after that, going to the show itself was extremely exciting, because it's obviously a strange time in Doctor Who. At that point, it hadn't really been confirmed that the series was going away for a while, and like the stage show itself, I mean, if you looked at it broadly and bluntly and honestly, it was a little bit rubbish, or maybe more than a little bit, but it was still very, very exciting to go along and see real Daleks on stage, or Daleks on stage, and the real Jon Pertwee as his Doctor. Just, there's such a collective willing, I realised later on, there's such a collective willing behind him in the theatre to sort of enhance the show, and sort of all of us, I realised, were probably all together just really imagining and willing that this show was probably better than it really was. He was brilliant on stage. It was like, it's really like watching a living legend. I got very, very excited, and towards the end of the show, when he came out and did his bow, I actually yelled out, "Go on, Jon Pertwee!" to the shock of my dad, and I don't think he thought I was going to say anything like that the whole day. I remember the first VHS of Doctor Who that I actually bought myself was The Time Warrior, which, again, it's just one of those classic stories introducing Sarah Jane, and her being introduced kind of changes the vibe of his whole Doctor, and it's actually a really good jumping on story in a lot of ways, because you're finding Sarah Jane for the first time. Jon Pertwee's character has to explain who he is. The Doctor has to explain to Sarah Jane who he is, and there's that great moment where he mentions Gallifrey for the first time. And of course, it's written by Robert Holmes, so it's brilliant, it's funny, it's got all those amazing other characters in it, and it's really interesting to see how Jon Pertwee's interpretation of the Doctor character can sometimes feel quite human. In retrospect, you think about Hartnell and Troughton before him, who were the kind of slightly otherworldly characters, and although he's sort of stood there with a big kind of pompadour and his velvet jacket and his frilly shirt, actually he's quite down to earth in a funny way. I never met him. I didn't queue up outside the Theatre Royal in Glasgow. I was quite a shy teenager and quite a shy kid, and I think I just was kind of afraid of meeting famous actors at that point. I kind of wish I had now in retrospect. I also really admire that when the show went away for a while, he was one of the only older Doctors trying to keep it going after everyone else who'd been involved sort of got embarrassed by it a little bit. He was a brilliant ambassador for the show right up to the end. I remember my dad telling me about his death after I just came downstairs on the morning of the Tuesday, 21st of May. My dad sort of just mentioned it kind of off the cuff. I think he actually said, well, that's your Jon Pertwee away. And I was kind of crushed, I have to say. I really felt like it was kind of it felt like in hindsight it's quite a flippant way to tell someone that this person that they had really admired and respected had passed away. And I did sort of feel for a while like, oh, well, that's it, it's over now, which is, a typically melodramatic thing for a teenager to do. But it did feel very shocking. It came out of nowhere, seemingly, or at least it seemed that way for me as a fan. I think, Jon Pertwee, as the Doctor, he was very of his time. He's very of the early 1970s, coming out of the swinging London feel and kind of this kind of dandy, as William Hartnell's Doctor calls him. But he just had this new dimension to the Doctor character. It's not a faltering or dithering side. He was very confident. He could obviously handle himself in a scrap, and of course that becomes quite an important trait of the character as the series went on.
It's Philip here from the Sirens of Audio podcast, and also Blake 7 The Way Back. 30 years, hard to believe it's been that long. My first memories of Jon Pertwee was when I was about 10. Back then, Doctor Who used to be replayed over and over again on the ABC in Australia. And I'd started watching from around the android invasion when I was 10 years old. We got to the Talons of Weng Chiang, and then it suddenly went back to Spearhead from Space. Now, as a person who'd only just started watching Doctor Who didn't understand anything about regeneration, it was a bit strange. But I always assumed that Jon Pertwee, and for a long time, for years actually, thought Jon Pertwee was the Doctor after Tom Baker. Because when we went back to Jon Pertwee, we then started working through his shows, which was all his existing episodes in colour, minus all the master ones. So there's no master shows, but we went from Spearhead to Space, then jumped straight to Day of the Daleks, and then basically most of the shows from there on. When we got to Planet of the Spiders and the first regeneration episode, and he regenerated, I was just devastated. He was such a great dynamic Doctor, over the top, just so much fun to watch always. And then he became Tom Baker, which confused me no end. And then I finally worked out that actually, Jon Pertwee was actually before Tom Baker. And the three Doctors, how that fitted in, and suddenly I realised what an amazing thing regeneration was. I first met Jon Pertwee a couple of years later. John came to Sydney and did some appearances, I think at Sydney Uni. I must have only been about 12 or 13 here. I do remember my mother taking me along, and he was in full costume and outfit, the velvet jacket, and he was just so over the top as well. And all I remember, I remember a number of things, but he was such a showman. He loved the crowds, he worked the crowds, he loved the kids. And I do remember him coming up and shaking my hand and thanking me for being there and just being so over the top. So I still have his autograph from then and a photo with him. And that would be my first time with Jon Pertwee.
And now, here's Andrew Smith, the writer of Full Circle.
I think the era of the Third Doctor is hugely underrated. I think Jon Pertwee was an outstanding Doctor and a really good actor. He really brought some weight to the series, which is unusual considering that he was known as a comedy actor before that. But he does an outstanding job. He takes it very seriously, and there are moments. I always think of the interrogation scene in Day of the Daleks when he's being interrogated by the future humans, as well as in that famous cliffhanger where the Daleks are around him and realise he is the Doctor, that he was Patrick Troughton. But you really, you see the sweat in his face, and you see the expression, his reactions. You really feel that he's afraid. Just as one example. And, my first memories of Doctor Who are Patrick Troughton, and specifically Yeti in the Underground. I remember the Troughton run, certainly the second half of it, and all of the Pertwee run. And I remember the transition. Now, bear in mind, I was 6.5 years old when episode 1 of Spearhead from Space went out. But not only do I remember that episode, but I remember the trailer, that it showed unit personnel looking at radar and then the Doctor falling out of the TARDIS. And then when the DVD came out and that trailer was on there with those scenes, I thought, yes, I remembered it correctly. Even though, again, I'd have been 6 years old, seeing that trailer, I would have seen it once, but it just fused into my memory, so excited that this new Doctor was coming along. And then he turned out to be so good. Yeah, so I avidly was in front of the TV every Saturday night. Apart from one time, we're visiting an aunt, and it was insisted upon that I sit at the table, and it's episode 3 of The Demons, and I didn't see it. I could see it. It was in the next room, but I could hear it, and that was a very frustrating Doctor Who experience in my youth. But I look back at that time very, very fondly, and I've really enjoyed writing for that character, for the Third Doctor. I've just fairly recently done, I think the third one, after Vengeance of the Stones and Storm of the Horrifacts, both of which were a real joy. Yeah, I never got to meet the man, but I adore what he did for the show.
Next, it's another naughty person who forgot to give themselves an intro. It's Johnny Candon.
Jon Pertwee was a very strange one in my life because I grew up with Tom Baker and didn't know anything about Jon Pertwee until Tom Baker regenerated into Peter Davison, which blew my mind. I didn't realise that the Doctor wasn't always Tom Baker, and kind of floored me. And my cousin Anne said to me, "Oh yeah, I remember when the Doctor Who was Jon Pertwee, who is Wurzel Gummidge now." And I was like, so many things going on in my head, because I adored Wurzel Gummidge. I thought Wurzel Gummidge was fantastic, and couldn't fathom Wurzel Gummidge as Doctor Who. This was before I was a proper fan. I became a huge fan. My fan button was turned on by Resurrection of the Daleks when I was 10. And so after that, I sought out every single thing about Doctor Who I could find. And it was pictures of Jon Pertwee that I would come across, the dandy thing, but it was all in articles about the 5 Doctors at that point, like the previous 5, all the Doctors, including the current one, the 5 Doctors. So I guess my first Jon Pertwee story would have been Day of the Daleks. Was that his first video release? And to be honest, it took me a long time to buy him as the Doctor, because his era was so different. It was like, obviously in Day of the Daleks there is time travel and space travel, time travel, but his era was so sort of different to what had gone before, and it took me a while to get my head around it, not walking out of the TARDIS all the time and "where have you brought me this time, old girl" type of thing. But I think Pertwee was the one who, Troughton was different to her, obviously, but it was still the Doctor, just different looking, change of personality, but still travelling around in time and space doing various things. Whereas I suppose at the time, Pertwee, it's hard to imagine what a huge change in format season 7 would have been. If you're a Doctor Who fan and you're watching every week, and every week it's the TARDIS arrives somewhere and they pile out and have an adventure and pile back in and go away again. It would be like if whoever the next Doctor was just set in Slough, or he worked for Torchwood, I suppose, or something like that. It would be it'd be interesting. So I think Pertwee's era was such a brave, strange, and different way to do it, and yet it worked. You know what I mean? It's sort of pushing against the different sides of Doctor Who to see how far it could go and still be Doctor Who was incredible. His performance, amazing, because obviously a comic actor known for his comedy roles, and suddenly he's playing it dead straight. There's obviously little comedy moments in his story, but it wasn't played that way. He was a very good straight actor, and made and a definite Doctor. He was like, even that. I guess it was the thing about the change in format was carried through by the fact that he played the Doctor, and we still believed he was the Doctor, and he was our Doctor. So no matter that he looked different, or the format was different, and everything was different, he brought that Doctor-ishness through with him. So yeah, fantastic. Absolutely, it's great. It's easy to say in hindsight that, oh yeah, it was an obvious bridge between. It would definitely, of course, that's how you do it. But if it wasn't for his performance and his likability, and he's not a very likable Doctor. Sometimes he's quite cranky. People talk about Hartnell being a cranky guy. Pertwee's he can be a bit of a dick sometimes, but we're always on his side, and he's always, we always, maybe it's because we know there's the twinkle there. He's got that doctorish twinkle that he, we know we're on the side of the angels, even if he is being nasty to people sometimes. So yeah, absolutely brilliant. I actually might go and watch Day of the Daleks now.
Aldur, general miscreant and homeless person that Kenny found under a bridge at Waterloo. My memories of Jon. He's the first Doctor I remember from my childhood. I do remember being quite scared by his stories. Obviously, Fourth Doctor is my Doctor, but I certainly remember Death to the Daleks, and specifically his last season. So they were great, and they were great stories. I didn't ever get to meet him, but I did see him at a convention once with Tom Baker. In fact, there was a lot of Doctor Who alumni there, but at the time I didn't appreciate what I was seeing. So I was seeing all these people. I think Terence Dix, was there as well, and it was back in the days when people were kind of like, in this adventure, you were wearing red underpants, and what were your feelings when you met the Daleks? And it was kind of like, it's a TV show, you know. But yeah, it's good. I mean, I think he's still one of my favourite action figures that we ever did as well. And season 7 of Jon Pertwee, I think, is edging its way into being my favourite currently. Because it's got Liz Shaw in it, so yeah. And I'm not as big a fan of Unit as they kind of became a bit formulaic after that for me.
Hi, I'm Ian McLaughlin. I write stuff. Jon Pertwee was my first Doctor, really. My first real memory of Doctor Who is the Sea Devils coming out onto the beach. That scared the living hell out of me. I'd been watching before that, but that's my first real memory of it. I did have a really powerful sense of deja vu when I got the Day of the Daleks VHS. Bits of that were really familiar. I think that might have been because of the Target novelisations. I was just a wee bit too young to have strong memories of the early 70s show. So Jon Pertwee, his Doctor really came alive to me in the Target novelisations. The description of him being heroic and dashing and exciting and doing his Venusian Aikido, they built my memory of him really. So when I got to see his Doctor on VHS and I saw his full run, his performance built on what I'd read in the books, and he was just great, such an engaging character. Season 7, that's one of my favourite seasons of the show of any point. I just love it. It's a total reinvention of what had gone before, and it was fresh and exciting and so much fun. I never actually did meet Jon Pertwee, but I did see his Doctor on stage in Aberdeen when the Ultimate Adventure toured, and I had an absolute ball. And I think he had a blast with that too. He was knocking on a bit by that point, but he certainly gave it full beans. He was a really, really good Doctor. I kind of wish he'd been around to do Big Finish, because he'd have been brilliant for it, and I think he'd have loved to carry on being the Doctor. He just always struck me as somebody who loved being the Doctor. He was great.
Hi, my name is Tim Trelaw. I play the audio Third Doctor for Big Finish. And, of course, the Third Doctor, as we know, was the marvellous Jon Pertwee. Now, I grew up with Tom Baker, the fourth, as my Doctor. I used to absolutely love him. And he's the one, actually, Tom Baker, who is sort of responsible for me being the Third Doctor for Big Finish, because I was playing this zombie lord, Victorian lord, in my first ever Big Finish, and Tom and Nick Briggs both said, "Oh, he sounds like John," and then it sort of steamrolled from there, really. Yeah, I love playing the Doctor. Obviously, I'm not an impersonator, I'm an actor, and I can't replicate exactly John's voice, but it's my version of Jon Pertwee playing the Third Doctor. So I add my sort of my own little nuances to it. However, I still regularly watch Third Doctor episodes because there's so much variety to John's performance. You know, one minute he's the sort of quite jovial and quite light, and then he goes into very serious, very angry sometimes, and he's also this swashbuckling man in a cape and a ruffed shirt. Yeah, I understand that he took the role of the Doctor very seriously, because I think a lot of his career he played a lot of comic parts, and so this was a big serious part for him, and he took it very seriously, and his delivery is just astonishing. He had a sibilant S, I believe, so that was kind of a struggle for him when he had lots of sonic screwdriver type lines in his scripts. But for me, that helps tremendously, because it's one of the things I can tap into John with, that particular developed S that he deployed to get around this his sibilant S. Katie Manning's been tremendous help. She's told me lots of stuff about Jon and lots of ways that he would go around creating his performance and how he was in filming, and that's really helped me too. And Jon has got such a unique voice. There's so many people we just know the voice straight away, like someone like David Attenborough or John Motson. And Jon, there's no mistaking whose voice that is. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to have this part. And if he was around, he'd obviously be playing it. But occasionally I look up to the stars and thank him for making this possibility a reality for me. And I'd like to thank all the fans as well for continuing to love the audio Third Doctor stories. I've written one myself, and it's a real investment, and it's such a pleasure doing it. Trying to honour the work of this great and by all accounts wonderful man, and and I hope I'm doing it in another 10 years.
Let you clear your throat, and welcome back. There we go. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your thoughts and memories of our very own Third Doctor. So, Tom, what have you been keeping up to these days? Tell us about your Substack.
Substack's going well. I mean, of course, I write every day for the Telegraph online, and it doesn't leave an awful lot of time to write the Substack. So I have been updating it as much as I should be, and I keep promising myself I will do more. But there's no shortage of subjects to write about. I mean, it's mainly political, the Substack, and with recent events in the Labour Party, there's no shortage of opportunities to write about it. But it can be exhausting. I mean, sometimes it's nice just to sit and talk about Doctor Who instead of Labour Party politics and give me a wee bit of a rest. And the Doctor Who isn't something I write about an awful lot on the Substack. And by the way, I'm delighted, Kenny, that you're referring to Jon Pertwee as the Third Doctor and not the 385th Doctor, as the new canon has decided he is, or the 2000th Doctor, some nonsense like that. He is the Third Doctor, the third incarnation.
Yeah, he's not to be referred to as 3 either, because that's just for children.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, if you've enjoyed today's episode, you can find us on social media. We've got our Facebook page. Come along like that and share your favourite Pertwee memories. You can find us on Twitter at Power of 3 Pod with a number 3, and of course with Blue Sky, which is at Finished Zine. Now, Tom, at this point we like to play out with a song.
Yes.
Don't you think it'd be appropriate to have Mr. Pertwee's "I Am the Doctor" now?
Well, of course, it's a classic of the genre.
Indeed. Quoted several times in Big Finish audios, but nobody else has sung it, so still the original and best. There is no such thing as a cover version yet.
Thank God.
Tom, been great to see you. Thanks for your time.
Right, cheers, Kenny.
I cross the void beyond the mind, the empty space that circles time. I see where others stumble blind to seek a truth they never find. Eternal wisdom is my guide. I am the Doctor. Through cosmic waste the TARDIS flies to taste the secret source of life. A present science can't deny existence.